Hi, this is Nathaniel Moore, and this is a quick demonstration to show an example attack scenario using a reverse shell, which ultimately results in a ransomware attack. Now, the purpose of this demo is to show why default security is not good security. And by that, I mean a fully patched and up-to-date Windows 11 machine running a fully up-to-date Windows Defender with all of the protection mechanisms. But we're going to compromise that machine, and then we're going to demonstrate why Cortex XDR or Cortex XSIAM is so necessary. So what we're going to do in this scenario is the unsuspecting user has received a payload, and the story behind this is that they're a new hire and a threat actor has seen that they are such from various LinkedIn posts. Based on knowledge of the company, they guessed their email, pretty easy to do nowadays, and they sent them an email while spoofing the email address and pretending to be the internal IT team. And in that email, they've provided a payload and they've said, look, you're new, you've got your new laptop, that's great, but you're not yet corporate compliant. So you're going to have to execute this. It will run a couple of checks and then it will grant you access to internal systems. And of course, with the threat of failing to do so, might impact your work. So without thinking much about it, the new hire is going to execute that payload. What's actually happening in the background is it will initiate a reverse shell to the listener or the C2 server being a Kali Linux threat actor. Once that reverse shell is established, the threat actor will then have the ability to execute further commands because that reverse shell includes a UAC and a AMSI bypass, which allows them effectively to elevate their privileges to full administrator control of the machine. Once they are at that point, they will then be able to move down to step 3, where they can evade defenses by bypassing Windows Defender. With Windows Defender bypassed, they can then transfer preferred tools, in this case Meterpreter, and Meterpreter will allow them then to carry out additional commands such as various persistence mechanisms through scripting, registry and service auto runs, process injection, and so on. With those attacks in place, they will be persistent, they will fly under the radar, and that will allow them to collect further information. And ultimately, once they've done that, they will transmit a payload to encrypt the device. I will show you the victim machine here. So as you can see, this is a fully up-to-date Windows 11 machine as of the 7th of October. And we have Windows Defender turned on, all with the default settings, and the definitions are up to date. The only thing that I have changed, just for the purpose of this demo, is the automatic sample submission, and that's simply because I don't want Microsoft to receive my payload and then me having to potentially rewrite that if they decide to write a signature, for example. So with that out of the way, this is the victim machine, and then we have our Kali Linux server over here, which is currently listening on port 7879 for any incoming connections. So the unsuspecting user receives this payload and the user doesn't think anything of it. It has flagged there that a threat was found. And if we open up Defender and go to the protection history, you can see that it says it was blocked. And what it detected was a UAC bypass. So from the perspective of the victim, they are safe. They might at this point think, oh no, I shouldn't have opened that, I should have done my due diligence, but at least Defender has protected me, the threat has been blocked, I'm all good. Now, in previous versions of Windows, prior to September of this year, and especially Windows 10, this attack would work without raising any alarms whatsoever. But actually, in the more recent version, where Microsoft have kind of upped their game with regards to UAC bypass techniques, they have identified this, they've told the user it's been blocked, and if anything, I actually think this is more dangerous because this gives a false sense of security. Because if we go over to our Kali box, you can see that actually I do in fact have access to this machine. If I do who am I, you can see now I know the name of the user that I have access to. So now that I'm on this machine, the next thing we want to understand is, okay, well, what level of privileges do I have? And we can do that with who am I groups. And here you can see that we've got high mandatory level. This effectively means we've got full administrator privileges. We will not receive any prompts for UAC, and the user won't receive any prompts. We can execute anything we want and we won't be stopped. So the first thing we might want to do as a threat actor is understand, well, how is Defender configured? And we can do this through get MP preference, and then we can look through the output to understand, okay, we've got some different exclusions that are set, what engines are turned on, turned off, and so on. But even if the exclusions are not set up in a way that we want, what we can do is define our own exclusion, because again, we've got full administrator access. Now, in previous versions of Windows, you could actually turn off Windows Defender completely through this mechanism. But since Microsoft introduced tamper protection, you can't do that. But what you can do is manually define specific exclusion paths, as I'm going to do here. Then we can run our attack from that exclusion path. So then Defender won't intervene in any way. So now that we've done that, the next thing we want to do is run our Meterpreter payload and transfer that Meterpreter payload over. So the first thing we want to do is start a Meterpreter listener on our Kali machine. And then what we want to do on the victim machine through this window is execute a series of commands, which is essentially going to download the payload that is fully encrypted. At the same time, it's going to download 7-zip to unzip that encrypted payload, and then it's going to execute it from the path that we've just set an exclusion against. This effectively will allow us to execute Meterpreter on the machine without raising any alarms and initiating our Meterpreter session. And now you can see that the session 1 has been opened. So if we do session list, we can see there's our user at the marketing PC. We've got the IP address information and so on. So let's interact with this session. Let's get the UID, and again we can confirm this is the machine that we are connected to. So now we can start doing some more interesting things, such as key scan. And let's just say, for example, that we are logging into LinkedIn or some other service and we type in, "This is my password." And essentially in real time, I can go to the Kali machine and do key scan dump, and there we are. This is my password. So everything the user types into their keyboard, we are going to receive a copy of. But let's up the game a little bit, right? We're on the machine, we've got Meterpreter in place, that's great, but what if the user identifies that service? What if the IT team or SOC team identify that there's a suspicious service running on that machine and they kill it? Well, we've lost access. So what we want to do is establish some form of persistence. And we can do that through a Meterpreter mechanism called persistence service. We will set the appropriate listener port, and we'll set the session to transfer this payload over as the one we are connected to right now. And then we'll run exploit. So this will transfer that service over, or set up the service, apply the appropriate registry keys and so on. And then we will have a second connection. As you can see here, our first one is number 1, KNERCOM, and then our second session is now running as system. So let's move over to the second service. And just to demonstrate how effective this is, let's reboot the machine. So now session 1 has closed. Our original reverse shell connection has been terminated, so we no longer have access to that, but we no longer need it. And if we move over to our Windows 11 machine here, we can see that it has rebooted. Now, the great thing about this exploit is that I don't have to interact with this machine. I don't have to log on, I don't have to do anything, because this is running as system. It started at boot. We don't even need the user to interact with this machine. So now we've got that level of access, we want to evade detection further. And we can do that by interacting first of all with the session we now have, getting the process ID, which we can see is 3920. And we want to migrate this process into something that would otherwise be deemed legitimate, safe, and would allow us to fly under the radar. So let's do a process lookup for winlogon.exe. This is a perfectly legitimate Windows built-in service that is currently running and allows users to log on with their user accounts. So that we can see now the process ID is 852, as you can see here. So what we're going to do is migrate from our existing process to the process ID of winlogon. And as you can see, as simple as that, if we now do get PID, you can see that our current process ID is that of winlogon. So now that we have persistence, we have used process injection to inject ourselves into winlogon and kind of fly under the radar from that perspective. We also have system level access because we elevated our privileges and we are running within winlogon. We can execute further commands such as kiwi. So kiwi will allow us to do things like dumping the credentials that are stored within the cache on the machine. So we can do this, for example, using a kiwi command and then a command called lsa dump cache. And there we can see that we have the MS cache of the user knurkum. So to demonstrate why this is a problem, if we take this hash, we can use something called hashcat that will effectively allow us to crack this hash value and understand what the plain text password is. So this command is going to download a password list file. It's going to unzip that, and then it's going to run hashcat on the machine. Now, for the purpose of the demo, I'm not actually going to use that password file because it will take a long time to churn through it and extract the matching password. I've just put the password in this text file instead. But in the real world, you wouldn't be able to fast track this. It would take a little bit longer. So we downloaded the password list file. We've opened hashcat. We've said, okay, well, run through that hash value using the algorithms that are supported. In this case, the domain cache credentials 2 algorithm. And we can see we've extracted the plain text password ABC123 ! So nice and secure. Now you can imagine at this point we could take that password and we could start hammering all different types of accounts, whether it be corporate or personal, and see where else we can get in with this password. So this is a nice demonstration of why you should try to avoid reusing passwords at all cost. So whilst we're on this machine, we can do a few other things. So for example, we know that the user is knurkum. So let's change directory to their user directory. And within this directory, for the purpose of the demo, I've created a folder called sensitive. So from here, we can look at what's on the machine. We can start listing out the files and we can see, oh, we've got financial records. This looks interesting. So we can do cat financial records. The text written in that file, again, just for demo purposes, this is financial data. You can imagine they'll be able to see the real stuff here. And then they might think, well, I want to get a copy of that. That's interesting. So what we can do is download everything in that folder. And you can see here it's being downloaded. So I can then have a local copy of that. So that's great. I can then use that through or for the purpose of potential extortion. But then to really manipulate this victim and make sure that I've kind of got them under my thumb, what I then might want to do is take this command. And what this will do is download a script called Ransom. It will download that to the machine and it will target this same file path for the purpose of a ransomware attack. And then if we do ls again, you can see all of the files now have this .nathaniel extension. These files are now fully encrypted and the user can't actually access these things unless I provide them with a decryption key. Okay, so now that we've done all that, let's go back over to this Windows machine. Let's log on with our password, ABC123 ! That we now know. And let's have a look what's happened on that machine. What alerts might we have? Now, even if there were alerts, you can imagine obviously we conducted the majority of that attack without the user logged in, so they wouldn't see anything anyway. But perhaps from a central management perspective, they might be monitoring for the alerts that Defender spits out. So let's open up Defender. Let's see what has it detected. Let's do protection history. Oh, the only thing that it detected was that initial payload that it told us it blocked. which of course we demonstrated it didn't block. So every single activity was not blocked, and the only thing that it even detected was the first thing that it gave a false negative response on. So pretty bad, really, right? And this is just a very simple demonstration showing how we can bypass UAC, we can bypass AMC detection, and we've effectively bypassed the latest definitions and security protections offered by Defender. Let's now move over to Cortex. What do we see from that perspective? Well, the good news is we saw everything. To state it as a summary, we can see we've got 50 different issues of various severities. We have different issue sources, being the agent, analytical, behavioral IOCs, and even our Palo Alto firewall that was sat within this subnet detected some suspicious activity too. Various playbooks were run off the back of those issues. We can also see we've got 34 different artifacts, being the Meterpreter reverse shell, which is flagged as malware, the ransom script, which is also flagged as malware, and you can see various other processes, payloads that were involved. Even the IP address of the Kali Linux machine was flagged. We can also see the various assets that were involved, including the marketing PC, the system user that was compromised, and the KNURCM user. We can also see here we've got an interesting flag against that user, that this machine or this user has had the Active Directory policy applied to never expire their password. Well, given what's just happened, maybe we should change that policy. Now, from a MITRE perspective, we can look at this from this drop down, and you can see we've recorded everything from the initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, and so on, all the way down to the impact where we had that ransomware activity. So let's move over to our individual issues and insights. And again, we can track this chronologically. So starting at the bottom, we've got our local analysis of the malware payload. Moving beyond that, we've got UAC bypass, where we modified the registry settings to achieve that. For those of you that are interested, I won't go into too much detail in this demo, but this bypass was achieved using a variation of the FOD helper exploit, which is why we're seeing these registry modifications. So we've got masquerading, we've got different process creations, execution of significantly renamed lolbin. The reason why this occurs is because one of the detection mechanisms that Microsoft implemented to detect the FOD helper exploit was if you try to execute something like PowerShell.exe from that registry key. Now, it's pretty easy to get around that because it's a string detection. So what I did was create a random file that is a copy of PowerShell and then executed the encoded command from that, which is why we're seeing this behavior being recognized. Then we can see we've got PowerShell recognition of base 64 encoded commands. There's the FOD helper process that's being exploited, running that base 64. Moving up next, you can see we've got our first detection from the firewall. So this is nothing to do with the agent. This is the firewall that's sitting between the victim and the Kali machine, detecting that we have a TCP shell established between those two, and this is being flagged as a backdoor. Let's assume, for example, that even if the agent wasn't configured to block this, with the firewall in place here, it would have blocked it as well. So we've got kind of multiple layers of defense in depth from that perspective. The addition of the exclusion list that I set within Defender is recorded here, as you can see. And then as we move up, we can see this is all to do with the transfer of the Meterpreter payload. The Palo Alto firewall has also recognized that the Metasploit Meterpreter connection was attempted. So we've detected that from a network level as well. The escalation into service, we've recorded that here, so we can understand that this user was doing privilege escalation and then was able to access and execute commands running as system. And then the persistence mechanism, you can see here the random service that was added, the various registry keys, the service that was started. This is more of a behavioral mechanism, but obviously the different process injection techniques, they were also recorded as well. We can also see here, for example, the process injection that we had our original process running from try to write a PE header to the remote process of winlogon.exe. So again, we've recorded that. And then finally, if we just work our way up, I won't go through too many more of these. These are all to do with the various commands, the extraction mechanisms, and so on that we executed within that interpreter prompt. The most interesting ones are the credential gathering protection engine. When we did the LSA dump using Mimikatz, this is recorded within Cortex. And then finally, the ransomware activity itself that we ended the attack on. Now, if you want to go through any more of these and extract more information, of course we can. So for example, if we look at our firewall issue, let's open the causality chain in a new tab. We can take a look at kind of what we recorded, how we stitched some of that data together. And if we zoom in, it kind of gives us a story of the attack. So pancompliance.exe, we can see that payload was executed. There were a number of detections to do with that. But then we had various PowerShell executions off the back of that. So we can see here, for example, that we had this PowerShell command that executed a script, which are called fod.ps1. Again, this is just part of the evasion technique, calling a script rather than the process itself. But ultimately, the process was called fodhelper.exe. So this gives us some insight into what the attacker was doing. And of course, we can click on any of the behaviors to understand why has this been flagged. Moving on, we can see our randomly renamed PowerShell, which then executed the subsequent base64 encoded command. Ultimately, this led to the execution and download of Meterpreter, which was then executed, as you can see here, Meterpreter at reverse.exe, running in the path that was excluded, hence it wasn't flagged. And the interesting thing on this particular causality chain is that not only do we have the detection chain from the perspective of the agent, but we can also see that this same marketing PC, zoom in a bit more, this same marketing PC tried to communicate to this IP address at the same time and triggered a warning on the firewall. So if we click on this behavior, you can see that there was a vulnerability exploit detection on the Palo Alto firewall. It was classed as a vulnerability with a high severity, but it was only detected. It wasn't blocked. So depending on how you configure this, obviously the agent could have blocked this attack. The firewall could have also blocked this attack if those engines were configured to do so. So this is just like one way to view the attack, but it's interesting to see the agent telemetry and the firewall telemetry kind of stitched together in this example. But of course, if you want to understand, well, what is this attack actually doing, rather than diving into all of the different processes, we can click on Forensic Highlights, and then we can see from a MITRE perspective what was actually done. And we can see execution, discovery, defense evasion, and so on. So the last thing I just want to show quickly is to do with the ransomware activity itself. So if we open up the causality card for the ransomware detection, this kind of gives us some interesting insight into what the attacker ultimately achieved. So we can see here the behavior that we detected was ransomware activity, script ransomware encrypted victim files, and this was detected through our behavioral threat protection engine. And we also have a suspicious PowerShell script detected. If we click on the PowerShell process itself and then pull up the all events here, we can actually get an understanding of, well, what was PowerShell doing then? Let's click on files, move this up, and if we pull in the action type alongside it, we can see we've got file read, write, create, delete. Write, create, read, delete. And as you can see, what's happening is the script was reading a certain file, it was renaming it, and then it was ultimately deleting the original file. So again, the user has no access to the original. The attacker does, because we transferred that to the Kali machine, but the victim is left with an encrypted file that they can't do anything with. And you can see all of the records of those various encrypted files. This was all configured in a listen-only mode, hence why we've got a lot of alerts and nothing was blocked. But if you were to configure the Cortex agent in prevention mode, then it would have been blocked at the very first stage. As soon as we scan that malware, we would have identified that, okay, no, that's not good. It's doesn't look legitimate. It would have been blocked. The UAC bypass mechanism wouldn't have even started. But even if that got through, then the subsequent alert would have kicked in. So effectively what we've got here, both on the agent and on the firewall where we had those various detections, we have at least 50 different opportunities to intervene and prevent this attack. Okay, I hope you found this useful and interesting. Again, this wasn't supposed to be some super advanced attack scenario. I wanted to keep this simple and straightforward and demonstrate ultimately why having default security is not good security, and why solutions like Cortex XDR or XSIAM are so powerful and so necessary. Because to be perfectly honest with you, I am not some super advanced threat actor, right? But there are people out there that are far more intelligent, far more capable than I am. So it really does highlight the necessity for having an advanced solution to deal with those sort of advanced attacks. So again, hope you found this useful. Thank you for watching. This is Nathaniel Moore signing out.